August 13th, 1704. Imagine a British general standing on a grassy hilltop in the early dawn, the air heavy with fog and anticipation. Below him, stretched across the rolling fields of Bavaria, lay an enemy army more than 56,000 strong, positioned behind an array of natural and man-made defenses that made them seem invincible. Every officer and soldier under his command knew the odds were stacked against them, yet the weight of history pressed down. Failure was unthinkable. If he hesitated, if he retreated, Europe might fall into the hands of France. The threat was not distant. It was immediate, palpable, and terrifying. This general was John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough, one of the most brilliant military minds of his era. But brilliance alone would not suffice. To win this battle, he would need audacity, deception, and a willingness to risk everything he had fought for. Imagine the stakes. A single misstep could mean the collapse of the Allied forces, the conquest of Vienna, and a century dominated by French power. And yet, against overwhelming odds, Marlborough made a choice that will be remembered, in theory, as a military masterpiece. The problem? Almost nobody today remembers it. Blenheim. The name may not resonate with a casual history enthusiast the way Waterloo or Trafalgar does. Yet, on that summer morning in 1704, Blenheim will become the turning point of a war that stretched across Europe, the stage where tactics, courage, and sheer determination collided in a perfect storm. Marlborough, with his keen eye for terrain and his unshakable confidence, faced a tactical nightmare. The French army, led by Marshal Tallard, was entrenched behind the Nebel Stream, a marshy, twisting waterway that cut through the battlefield. Their lines were reinforced with redoubts, artillery placements, and fortifications that seemed to laugh in the face of any attacking force. Consider the human element for a moment. Marlborough's men were tired. Many had marched hundreds of miles across Europe in the weeks leading up to this battle, enduring rain-soaked roads, disease, and the gnawing uncertainty of whether their sacrifices would amount to anything. Morale in any army can be as fragile as a soap bubble. One word of doubt, one sign of weakness, and it bursts. Yet, Marlborough inspired confidence. He communicated not only orders but a vision, a sense of purpose that made men willing to face almost certain death for the sake of a cause they barely understood in its entirety. The general's mind was already calculating probabilities, assessing the enemy's weaknesses, envisioning every possible scenario. He knew that a frontal assault on Tallard's position could be catastrophic. The French had trained for this. Their defenses were formidable. And yet, Marlborough's genius lay in seeing beyond the obvious, in finding opportunities where others saw only obstacles. His plan was daring in every sense, to deceive allies and enemies alike, to march his army across a vast stretch of territory in secrecy, and then to strike at the enemy's most vulnerable points with precision and coordination. Imagine standing there with him, on that foggy hilltop, hearing the distant clang of artillery as French scouts reported to their commanders, sensing the quiet tension before the storm. Every movement mattered. Every decision could tip the scales between victory and disaster. Marlborough's choice was not just about tactics. It was about vision, courage, and the ability to act when indecision would have been safer, easier, and more human. The stakes of this moment are almost unimaginable. Europe at the time was a continent on edge. The balance of power was fragile, with alliances constantly shifting, treaties being signed and broken, and monarchs scheming for advantage. A single battle could reshape borders, change the fates of nations, and alter the course of history for generations. And hey, in the rolling fields near Blenheim, Marlborough held the fate of much of Europe in his hands. It is easy, looking back centuries later, to forget the human drama behind these events. The fear in the eyes of soldiers, the tension in commanders' voices, the cold calculation of strategy set against the chaos of human emotion. Yet even in this moment of immense pressure, Marlborough did not falter. He had studied the battlefield, understood the enemy, and, most importantly, trusted in his own judgment. His decision-making combined logic with intuition, preparation with improvisation. Where others saw risk, he saw opportunity. And that is the essence of what makes this battle perfect in the eyes of historians. The way one man, acting decisively, could orchestrate an outcome that seemed almost impossible. Now, think for a moment about the psychology of leadership under extreme circumstances. Marlborough had to command not only a vast army but also the trust of his allies, many of whom did not fully comprehend his strategy. Deception was part of his plan, and that meant risking misunderstanding, even mutiny. To lead effectively, he needed clarity, decisiveness, and the ability to convey calm in the midst of chaos. Every word mattered. Every order could become the difference between life and death for thousands of men. The tension was electric. The fog on the battlefield was more than a physical phenomenon. It was symbolic of the uncertainty and peril that hung over everyone present. And then there was the enemy. Marshal Tallard was no fool. He was experienced, disciplined, and confident in the strength of his fortifications. But overconfidence can be a fatal flaw, and Marlborough intended to exploit it. The French believed themselves secure, entrenched behind rivers and redoubts, thinking no army could breach their defenses without suffering horrendous losses. They were prepared for a battle of attrition, a slow, grinding fight that would bleed the attackers dry. What they could not foresee were the audacity, the cunning, and the relentless energy of Marlborough's campaign. It is at this point that the story begins to feel almost cinematic, like a script written with perfect suspense. You have a general facing impossible odds, an enemy entrenched behind seemingly impregnable defenses, and the clock ticking relentlessly forward. Every decision is magnified. Every choice carries enormous consequences. The stage is set for a battle that will not just decide the outcome of a war, but reshape the political landscape of Europe for decades. And yet, despite the enormity of the moment, this story has faded from popular memory. Blenheim is not commonly cited alongside Waterloo or Trafalgar. Why? Perhaps because it is a battle defined by strategy rather than spectacle, by meticulous planning rather than dramatic last-minute heroics. Perhaps because its lessons are subtle, buried in the brilliance of execution rather than in a single iconic moment. And yet, for those who study military history, Blenheim is a case study in perfection, a demonstration of how vision, courage, and meticulous planning can overcome even the most daunting obstacles. So as we begin our exploration of this battle, pause for a moment and imagine yourself there. Hear the clatter of distant drums, the murmurs of soldiers preparing for combat, the low murmur of officers discussing strategy. See the fog rolling over the fields, hiding the enemy, amplifying uncertainty. Feel the tension in the air, the weight of responsibility pressing down on Marlborough's shoulders. This is a story not just of armies and strategy, but of human courage, intellect, and the capacity to act decisively when history demands it. August 13th, 1704. On that misty morning near Blenheim, one man made a choice that would echo through the centuries. A choice that seemed impossible. A choice that would change Europe forever. And yet, for most people today, it is almost completely forgotten. What happened next became the most perfect battle ever fought, yet it has been almost completely forgotten. Imagine that, a military engagement so flawlessly executed that historians still marvel at it more than 3 centuries later. And yet, the name Blenheim evokes little recognition outside academic circles. It is a paradox of history, a moment so monumental in shaping Europe's future, and yet its memory has slipped quietly into the shadows. The notion of a perfect battle is one that military scholars rarely apply lightly. Perfection in war does not mean the absence of bloodshed, nor does it imply that the victory came without cost. It means that a commander, under circumstances that seemed insurmountable, leveraged every possible advantage: terrain, timing, morale, deception, logistics, and the psychology of both allies and enemies, to orchestrate an outcome that was decisive, efficient, and historically transformative. Blenheim ticks every one of those boxes. Let's set the stage further. Picture Europe in 1704. The continent is a chessboard of alliances, treaties, and rivalries. France, under Louis XIV, is at the peak of its power. Its armies are feared across the continent, disciplined, well-equipped, and led by brilliant marshals. The French army had been advancing relentlessly, threatening to dominate Central Europe entirely. If they had succeeded, the political map of the continent could have looked very different. The Holy Roman Empire weakened, Vienna vulnerable, and the balance of power decisively in French favor. In other words, failure was not an option. Victory was imperative. Enter Marlborough. His genius lay not just in courage, but in his ability to see beyond conventional tactics. Most generals would have balked at the idea of attacking such a fortified position head-on. They would have opted for cautious maneuvering, waiting for reinforcements, or skirting the enemy. But Marlborough saw an opportunity where others saw only risk. He understood that the French overconfidence could be exploited, that the apparent strength of the enemy could become a weakness if struck at the right moment with precision. And it wasn't just strategy on paper. Marlborough's campaign leading to Blenheim involved intricate deception. He misled his allies, communicated misinformation to the enemy, and orchestrated movements so secretive that even the soldiers themselves sometimes didn't understand the larger plan. Imagine marching tens of thousands of troops across hundreds of miles through foreign lands, under the cover of secrecy, all while maintaining the illusion of inactivity. It required logistical genius, unwavering discipline, and trust between commanders, officers, and men. One slip, one premature revelation, and the entire plan could unravel. This is part of what makes the story of Blenheim so compelling. History is littered with battles where one side had the advantage but squandered it. Entire campaigns have been lost because a general hesitated, overestimated the enemy, or failed to coordinate effectively. Yet Marlborough's execution was almost surgical. Every maneuver had purpose. Every attack was calculated. Every risk was deliberate. In military terms, Blenheim was a near-perfect orchestration of chaos. Consider the human drama. Thousands of soldiers march into battle knowing the odds were against them, yet inspired by a commander whose calm authority and strategic clarity instill confidence. Imagine the fear, the adrenaline, the anticipation in their hearts as they approached a river that was swollen, marshy, and treacherous. They were about to cross into the jaws of an enemy believed to be impregnable. Yet they did so because they trusted Marlborough, and he had earned that trust. And then there was Marshal Tallard, commanding the French. He had prepared meticulously, confident that the combination of natural barriers and fortifications would make his position unassailable. He expected a standard engagement, a battle where the French could hold their ground and repel any assault with calculated efficiency. What he did not anticipate was the ingenuity and audacity of Marlborough's approach, nor the precision with which the Allied forces would strike. Tallard's confidence, a strength under ordinary circumstances, became his undoing. It's remarkable to reflect on how the psychological element played into this perfect battle. Commanders must understand not only the enemy's tactics, but also their mindset. Marlborough exploited French assumptions, provoked mistakes, and manipulated perceptions. By controlling the narrative on the battlefield, he forced the French to react, often too late or in the wrong manner. This is a mark of a commander operating at the highest level of strategic thought, not simply reacting to the battlefield, but shaping it entirely. Now, pause and imagine the moment when the battle began. The fog over the fields, the sound of distant drums, the anxious murmur of soldiers, the tension in officers' voices. The calm before the storm is almost tangible. And then, the attack. Marlborough's troops move with discipline, crossing difficult terrain, engaging the enemy at precisely the right points, exploiting weaknesses that others had overlooked. The river, once a barrier, became a controlled channel for brilliant tactical maneuvers. Cavalry charges were timed perfectly, artillery positioned for maximum effect. Every element of warfare, logistics, strategy, psychology, was deployed in harmony, and the results were staggering. The victory was decisive, complete, and immediate. Thousands of French troops were killed, captured, or forced to retreat. Entire units surrendered without firing a shot because the situation was hopelessly compromised. Vienna was saved from invasion. French dominance in Central Europe was shattered, and the balance of power shifted in ways that would resonate for the next century. It is rare in history to see such total success achieved with both efficiency and elegance, and even rarer for it to remain underappreciated in popular memory. This raises an intriguing question. Why do we not remember Blenheim the way we remember other battles like Waterloo or Trafalgar? Perhaps it is because Blenheim is a story of planning, precision, and intellect, rather than sheer drama or last-minute heroics. Perhaps it is because the lessons of Marlborough's genius are subtle, requiring careful study to appreciate fully. Unlike battles that lend themselves to cinematic spectacle, Blenheim's brilliance lies in the orchestration, the invisible threads of strategy that connect every movement, every decision, every moment of courage. And yet, this is exactly what makes it so fascinating. Blenheim challenges our understanding of what it means to win a battle perfectly. It is a testament not just to military skill, but to leadership, psychology, and human determination under extreme circumstances. It reminds us that history is shaped not only by chance, but by deliberate choices made by individuals willing to risk everything for a greater purpose. As we prepare to dive deeper into the story, imagine yourself stepping onto those fields near Blenheim. Hear the distant sounds of preparation, the clatter of armor, the murmurs of anxious soldiers, the low rumble of horses waiting to charge. Feel the fog rolling over the marshes, obscuring the enemy and amplifying uncertainty. Sense the tension in Marlborough's stance, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him as he surveys the terrain. Every decision, every command, every movement carries monumental consequences. This is not just a story of military strategy. It is a story of human courage, intellect, and the audacity to act decisively in the face of overwhelming odds. It is a story of a battle so meticulously executed that it earned the admiration of historians for centuries, yet so quietly forgotten by the world at large. And it is the story we are about to unfold, an exploration of audacity, genius, and the extraordinary events that made the Battle of Blenheim one of the most remarkable and most overlooked moments in history. To understand the genius of the Battle of Blenheim, one must first understand the man behind it, John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough. He was not merely a soldier, he was a strategist, a visionary, and above all, a master of deception. Before the clash of armies near the Nebel Stream, Marlborough orchestrated a campaign that, in scope and audacity, rivals any in European history. It wasn't just a battle he was planning. It was a theatrical masterpiece in which secrecy, misdirection, and precision would play starring roles. The first act of this drama was deception. Marlborough knew that the French and even his own allies were watching his every move. Rumors traveled faster than armies, and intelligence, though crude by today's standards, could sway decisions across borders. If Tallard, the French commander, believed Marlborough's army was marching eastward, or perhaps lingering to regroup, he would adjust his defenses accordingly. But Marlborough had no intention of marching predictably. Instead, he devised a series of feints and false reports, convincing friend and foe alike that his forces were moving in one direction while in reality they were preparing for a decisive strike elsewhere. This was a battle of shadows before a battle of swords. Now, consider the logistics. Marlborough's army numbered some 40,000 men, accompanied by thousands of horses, wagons, artillery pieces, and supplies. Moving such a force in secrecy across 250 miles of European terrain was a feat few could imagine even today. Roads were often little more than dirt tracks, rivers and forests posed constant obstacles, and the risk of disease or attrition was ever present. Each step had to be coordinated, each unit disciplined, each commander fully briefed, or at least kept in the dark as needed, to maintain the illusion of inactivity. It is one thing to plan an attack on paper. It is another to make tens of thousands of human beings move as a single organism across hundreds of miles without alerting the enemy. Marlborough's plan required absolute precision in timing. If a column arrived early, it might alert the French to his true intentions. If one unit lagged behind, it could expose the army's flanks. Every march, every bivouac, every night spent under the open sky had to be meticulously calculated. Soldiers slept fitfully, often on muddy fields, while officers calculated distances, river crossings, and the enemy's possible reactions. The fatigue was immense, but Marlborough understood a fundamental truth of war. Momentum is as much psychological as it is physical. An army that moves confidently, decisively, and in seeming secrecy can unsettle an opponent before a single shot is fired. And move they did. Imagine columns of men snaking through the European countryside, the early morning fog masking their approach, their boots and wheels pressing into soil softened by recent rains. Marlborough had to keep morale high, not just for the sake of effectiveness, but because tired, demoralized soldiers are liabilities. He rode among the troops, issuing orders, observing, and inspiring confidence. His presence was a symbol. Where Marlborough went, the army would follow. Where he led, victory seemed possible, and the French, believing they had the upper hand, did not suspect the storm gathering in the west. This campaign was more than just a march. It was a carefully choreographed deception. Marlborough deliberately exposed parts of his force to create illusions. Scouts were sent in visible but inconsequential directions. Camps were established where no major units were stationed. Letters and rumors were allowed to leak to the enemy. All of this was designed to manipulate perceptions, to convince the French that Marlborough was advancing cautiously, or even hesitating, while in reality Every step brought him closer to the point of attack. It was psychological warfare at its finest. Control the enemy's expectations, and you control the battlefield before a single clash of arms. But secrecy alone could not guarantee success. Marlborough had to maintain operational flexibility. He knew that terrain could be unpredictable. Rivers might rise, roads could become impassable, local populations might resist or aid either side. Communication between units had to be rapid, precise, and reliable. Signals, messengers, and officers' knowledge of the plan were all crucial. A single miscommunication could unravel weeks of careful planning, leaving the army vulnerable and the French emboldened. Yet Marlborough excelled in these conditions. His staff was disciplined, his orders clear, and his contingency planning exceptional. The audacity of this march cannot be overstated. While armies of the era typically moved slowly and cautiously, Marlborough forced his troops to cover extraordinary distances, maintaining formation, readiness, and secrecy. They traversed mountains, forded rivers, and navigated dense forests, all while keeping their true objective hidden. Think of the psychological strain. Men marching not toward the obvious goal, but toward a mystery, unsure when or whether decisive confrontation would occur. Yet they trusted their commander, and that trust became an invisible weapon in Marlborough's arsenal. Marlborough's deception reached its pinnacle when the Allied forces approached Blenheim. By this point, the French were committed to defending their position, convinced that the British advance was predictable. They had concentrated their forces along the Nebel Stream, fortifying their positions, confident that no army could cross it without catastrophic losses. And then Marlborough struck, not merely with force, but with strategy, timing, and the element of surprise. The culmination of weeks of secret maneuvering was about to unfold in a battle so perfectly executed that historians still study it with awe. It is important to pause and consider the human dimension once more. Soldiers, many of whom had never seen the wider theater of war, were thrust into an operation that demanded both endurance and discipline. They had to trust not only in their training, but in the vision of a commander whose genius many could not fully comprehend. Leadership in such circumstances is both an art and a science. The ability to inspire, to direct, and to instill confidence amidst uncertainty is what separates great generals from the merely competent. Marlborough embodied both qualities. Furthermore, this march and deception highlight an often overlooked aspect of warfare, the power of perception. Battles are won not only on fields and in skirmishes, but in the minds of the enemy. By controlling what the French thought Marlborough was doing, he forced them to make decisions based on false premises. Overconfidence, misallocation of forces, and misjudged offensive positions were the direct result of Marlborough's psychological manipulation. He wove a narrative of inevitability that led Tallard to underestimate the true threat until it was too late. And yet, for all its brilliance, this part of the story is almost invisible to popular memory. We celebrate battlefield heroics, dramatic last stands, and singular moments of courage. We rarely pause to appreciate the months of careful preparation, the meticulous planning, the deception, and the psychological mastery that make a victory not just possible, but overwhelmingly decisive. Blenheim was a triumph not because of reckless bravery, but because of calculated audacity and strategic genius, the kind of victory that requires not just courage, but intellect and foresight on a monumental scale. Imagine standing on the plains of Bavaria as Marlborough's columns advanced silently through the countryside, knowing that at any moment the fog could lift, the French could discover the true position, and disaster could strike. Every decision mattered. Every mile covered in secrecy was a small victory. Every obstacle overcome, a swollen river, a narrow pass, a misdirected detachment, was a testament to leadership and planning. This march was itself a battle, fought before a single cannon was fired, and it set the stage for what will become a historically perfect engagement. Finally, consider the broader implications. By executing this march and deception flawlessly, Marlborough not only set the conditions for victory at Blenheim, but he also reshaped the strategic landscape of Europe. The French, misled and overconfident, were vulnerable. Vienna and the Holy Roman Empire were saved from imminent threat. Alliances shifted, morale surged among Marlborough's allies, and the balance of power tilted in favor of Britain and its partners. One man's vision, executed with audacity and precision, altered the trajectory of a continent. The morning of August 13th, 1704, dawned thick with mist over the rolling plains of Bavaria. The fog clung to the fields like a shroud, obscuring the positions of both armies and amplifying the sense of anticipation. For the men of the Allied army, the day that had been months in preparation had finally arrived. For the French under Marshal Tallard, it would be a day that began with confidence but would end in catastrophe. Marlborough surveyed the battlefield from a slight rise, the early light glinting of the polished armor of his officers and the disciplined formations of his troops. Ahead lay the Nebel Stream, a twisting, marshy waterway that the French had fortified with redoubts and artillery emplacements. Across it, 56,000 French soldiers waited, their lines bristling with confidence, believing themselves impregnable. But Marlborough, who had studied every contour of the terrain, saw opportunity where others saw barriers. The first phase of the attack was not about brute force. It was about precision, coordination, and exploiting the enemy's assumptions. Marlborough deployed his troops in a manner designed to stretch the French line, drawing their attention to weaker points while preparing concentrated assaults elsewhere. Imagine the tension as soldiers moved silently into position, muskets loaded, cannons poised, cavalry ready to charge. Every unit knew its role, every officer understood the timing, and every step was a part of a meticulously choreographed plan. The initial skirmishes began with artillery fire. The booming of cannonballs echoed across the foggy plains, shaking the earth and rattling nerves. Marlborough's artillery was positioned to maximize effect, targeting French fortifications while masking the movement of infantry and cavalry behind natural cover. The French responded in kind, unleashing volleys and counter-battery fire, confident in the strength of their positions. Yet the Allies had anticipated this. The French focus on visible threats left other sectors lightly defended, precisely where Marlborough intended to strike. As the first infantry units waded through the marshy banks of the Nebel Stream, the battle's human drama became apparent. Soldiers struggled through water and mud, weighed down by armor and weapons, their boots sinking into the soft, treacherous soil. Yet the morale instilled by Marlborough's leadership and the months of disciplined marching carried them forward. Fear was present, undoubtedly, but it was accompanied by purpose and trust. They were not just attacking an enemy. They were executing a plan so audacious that its brilliance would only be appreciated in hindsight. One of the most critical moments came with the cavalry charges across the Nebel. Imagine the pounding of hooves, the snorting of horses, the gleam of steel in the dim light as riders surged forward, cutting through enemy lines with speed and precision. These charges were not random acts of valor. They were timed to coincide with infantry assaults and artillery barrages, creating a synchronized effect that overwhelmed the French defenses. The fog, once a hindrance, became a tool, concealing movement and creating confusion among Tallard's troops. Tallard, initially confident, began to realize that something was amiss. His left flank was being tested in ways he had not anticipated. Artillery that seemed harmless at first began to wreak havoc on previously secure positions. Cavalry units appeared unexpectedly in his rear, cutting off retreat paths and spreading panic. His soldiers, trained and disciplined though they were, faced a barrage of assaults coordinated with a level of timing and precision that left them disoriented. As the battle unfolded, the human cost became visible. Smoke from gunfire and cannon created a haze that mingled with the morning fog. The cries of wounded soldiers, the shouts of officers, and the thunder of artillery created a cacophony that tested nerves and stamina alike. Yet, even amidst this chaos, Marlborough's command structure held firm. Orders were relayed with clarity, units reinforced when needed, and the momentum of the attack was maintained. This was not luck. It was a result of careful preparation, discipline, and the ability to think several moves ahead of the enemy. Marlborough's strategy also included exploiting Tallard's mistakes. The French commander, confident in the strength of his positions, had concentrated troops in certain areas while leaving others relatively undefended. Marlborough observed these choices and directed his attacks with surgical precision, striking weak points at exactly the right moment. Entire sections of the French line were forced to collapse under pressure, while reinforcements arrived too late to change the outcome. The Allied artillery, placed on elevated ground, began to have a devastating effect. Cannonballs tore through fortifications and ranks alike, shattering morale as well as bodies. Marlborough's careful placement ensured that his firepower maximized damage while minimizing risk to his own troops. The combination of artillery, infantry, and cavalry working in seamless coordination was something rarely seen in European warfare, a true demonstration of battlefield orchestration. And then came the moment that would define Blenheim's perfection: the surrender of French troops without firing a shot. Approximately 12,000 elite soldiers, facing encirclement and aware of the impossibility of holding their positions, chose to lay down arms rather than fight to the death. Imagine the shock among both armies. The Allies astonished at the scale of the surrender, the French demoralized at the sudden collapse of an entire contingent. This was a victory achieved not through luck or overwhelming numbers, but through a combination of deception, timing, discipline, and the exploitation of enemy miscalculations. The battle raged on throughout the day, with each engagement following the pattern Marlborough had envisioned. Cavalry charges exploited openings created by artillery. Infantry pressed forward against weakened positions. Reserves were committed at precisely the right moment to reinforce success or plug gaps. By midday, the French defensive line was fragmented, unable to mount an effective coordinated response. Marlborough's foresight, combined with the discipline and bravery of his men, had turned what seemed an impossible situation into a strategic triumph. As evening approached, the scale of the victory became apparent. Thousands of French soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured. Key positions had been seized, and the Allied army retained a cohesion and operational capacity. Vienna, the Holy Roman Empire, and much of Central Europe had been spared the threat of French domination. The balance of power in Europe had shifted, and it had done so decisively in a single, masterfully executed battle. What makes this part of the story truly remarkable is a combination of audacity and precision. Marlborough did not merely attack. He controlled the battle. He anticipated enemy movements, exploited psychological weaknesses, and orchestrated a symphony of military maneuvers that few could rival. Every element of his plan, from the early morning deployment to the surrender of French troops, reflected a level of strategic thinking and operational excellence rarely seen in history. Even today, military historians study Blenheim not for its heroism alone, but for its perfection in execution. The battle demonstrates how planning, deception, and leadership can transform an ostensibly hopeless scenario into a decisive victory. It is a lesson in how vision and preparation, combined with courage and discipline, can overcome obstacles that seem insurmountable. Finally, imagine the aftermath. The battlefield, strewn with the remnants of conflict, quiets as night falls. Marlborough's men, exhausted but victorious, begin to regroup. The French retreat, disoriented and demoralized. The Nebel stream, once a formidable barrier, is now a symbol of the ingenuity and precision that won the day. And Marlborough, ever aware of the broader implications, knows that this victory is not merely a tactical success. It is a turning point that will echo through history for decades to come. Blenheim, in its combination of audacity, deception, and flawless execution, stands as a testament to what human planning and courage can achieve under pressure. It was a battle that saved nations, reshaped power structures, and demonstrated the heights of military genius. And yet, for all its significance, it remains largely forgotten outside the halls of history. As the smoke cleared from the fields of Blenheim, the magnitude of Marlborough's victory began to reveal itself. The battle had been won with precision, audacity, and brilliant coordination, but the true consequences extended far beyond the immediate military success. Europe was watching, and the reverberations of this one day would alter the course of the continent for decades to come. Vienna, the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, was saved. Had the French succeeded in breaking through Marlborough's forces, the city would have fallen, leaving Central Europe exposed to French domination. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. Empires rise and fall not just through force of arms, but through the perception of strength. By halting the French advance, Marlborough effectively preserved not only territories, but the very idea of resistance against the Sun King's ambitions. The reaction in Paris was immediate and chaotic. Marshal Tallard, whose confidence had been so unshakable that morning, was captured, along with thousands of his troops. Louis XIV's court, accustomed to victories and accustomed to seeing the French army as nearly invincible, faced the shock of a defeat that was both total and humiliating. Letters and reports from the front described the surrender of entire divisions, units of elite French soldiers laying down arms without firing a shot. This was not just a military loss. It was a psychological blow that undermined French morale and prestige. Within the Allied camp, the atmosphere was one of cautious triumph. Soldiers and officers alike understood that their success was extraordinary. The battle had demanded discipline, endurance, and courage beyond what was typical in European warfare at the time. Every maneuver that Marlborough had carefully orchestrated, from the feints to the secret march to the timing of infantry assaults and cavalry charges, had succeeded, producing a decisive victory that not only defeated the enemy but also preserved the integrity of the Allied forces. The broader political consequences were equally profound. Blenheim sent a clear message to Europe. The balance of power was not static. France, long dominant, could be checked and even defeated when strategic brilliance met disciplined execution. For Britain and its allies, the victory solidified credibility, strengthened alliances, and demonstrated that coordinated, intelligent planning could overcome numerical or positional disadvantages. It was, in essence, a proof of concept for modern coalition warfare. Consider the domino effect. The Holy Roman Empire, having avoided French occupation, could continue to resist further advances. Allied forces, emboldened by success, gained confidence for future campaigns. France, on the other hand, faced the challenge of regrouping, reassessing strategy, and coping with the political fallout of a humiliating defeat. Leaders across Europe took note, recalibrating their expectations and alliances in light of Marlborough's audacious triumph. This single battle had shifted the entire geopolitical landscape. Yet, it wasn't merely the immediate tactical or political outcomes that mattered. Blenheim also established a legacy of military innovation and leadership. Historians often point to Marlborough's use of deception, coordination, and psychological manipulation as pioneering for the era. He demonstrated that war could be waged not just through brute force but through the careful orchestration of perception, morale, and strategic timing. The lessons learned at Blenheim would influence commanders for generations, even if the general public would later forget the battle's details. The human cost of the victory, while immense, was also managed with remarkable discipline. Casualties were significant, as expected in any large-scale engagement of the period, yet the Allied forces avoided the catastrophic losses that might have occurred in a frontal assault against such a well-fortified enemy. Marlborough's understanding of terrain, timing, and enemy psychology minimized unnecessary slaughter while maximizing strategic gain, a hallmark of his genius. From a military perspective, Blenheim demonstrated the power of initiative and calculated risk-taking. Marlborough could have hesitated, waiting for reinforcements or more favorable conditions. He could have chosen a conservative approach, attacking only after exhausting the enemy through attrition. Instead, he acted decisively, seizing the initiative and dictating the terms of engagement. This principle, that the commander who controls the tempo and direction of battle often dictates its outcome, will become a central tenet of military doctrine in subsequent centuries. The French, meanwhile, were left to reckon with failure. Marshal Tallard's capture was a significant blow, not only in terms of manpower but in leadership credibility. Entire divisions had been rendered ineffective, and French strategic planning required a reassessment. Louis XIV, a monarch accustomed to the image of unassailable power, had to confront the reality that even his best generals could be outmaneuvered by audacity, preparation, and intellect. Blenheim exposed vulnerabilities in the French approach, vulnerabilities that opponents of France would exploit in the years to come. It is also worth noting the ripple effect on European culture and politics. Victories like Blenheim shaped perceptions of national strength, influenced alliances, and even affected public opinion and propaganda. Marlborough's triumph became a symbol of British capability and leadership, reinforcing perception of Britain as a rising power on the continent. Although the battle would fade from popular memory in later centuries, at the time it was celebrated across Europe, its significance recognized by diplomats, generals, and monarchs alike. In many ways, Blenheim represents the intersection of strategy, psychology, and politics. The battlefield itself is only one dimension of victory. The outcomes extend far beyond the immediate clash of arms. The French misjudgment, the disciplined execution of the Allied plan, and the broader consequences for European diplomacy all combined to make Blenheim a turning point. It was not simply a battle won. It was a balance of power recalibrated, a geopolitical moment that reshaped alliances and strategy for decades. The psychological dimension cannot be understated. For Marlborough's men, the victory reinforced discipline, confidence, and trust in leadership. For the French, the shock of unexpected defeat sowed doubt, hesitation, and the need for strategic reevaluation. Leaders across Europe observed and learned. Audacity, preparation, and intelligence could overcome the numerical and positional advantages traditionally relied upon. Blenheim became, in essence, a lesson in leadership under extreme pressure, a case study in how human ingenuity and courage can alter history. As the sun set over the fields, the aftermath of the battle became clear. Thousands of French soldiers were captured, many elite units had surrendered without a fight, and the remaining forces retreated in disarray. Allied forces regrouped, tending to the wounded, securing positions, and preparing for future campaigns. The battlefield, scarred and silent, bore witness to a day that would influence European history for generations. Yet, the brilliance of Marlborough's strategy was not only in the victory itself, but in the orchestration of events that led to it, the careful planning, the secretive march, the exploitation of enemy assumptions, and the precise timing of every move. Blenheim also marked the emergence of Britain as a credible continental power. Up to that point, Britain's military influence had often been limited to naval engagements or colonial conflicts. By successfully projecting power on the European continent and coordinating with allies in a complex theatre of war, Britain demonstrated strategic sophistication and military capability on a scale previously reserved for France and Austria. The battle's success provided momentum for future campaigns and established a reputation that would shape European diplomacy in the early 18th century. Yet, despite its significance, the battle remains lesser known today. Historians, scholars, and military strategists recognize its brilliance, but the general public rarely does. Why is that? Perhaps because its brilliance lies in planning, coordination, and subtle genius rather than singular act of heroism or dramatic last-minute charges that make for compelling stories in popular culture. Blenheim is a victory of intellect, discipline, and audacity, not just courage. It is a reminder that history often remembers spectacle more vividly than precision. In sum, the immediate consequences of Blenheim were monumental. Vienna was saved, French dominance was checked, and the balance of power in Europe shifted decisively. Strategically, it demonstrated the power of audacity, deception, and timing. Politically, it strengthened alliances, reshaped perceptions of national power, and influenced the course of European diplomacy. Psychologically, it bolstered Allied morale while shattering French confidence. And for Marlborough, it cemented his place among the great military commanders of history, a figure whose genius continues to be studied centuries later. For a battle so decisive, so perfectly executed, it is remarkable and puzzling that Blenheim does not occupy a central place in popular memory the way Waterloo, Trafalgar, or Agincourt do. The reasons for this are complex, a mixture of historical accident, narrative focus, and the subtle genius of the battle itself. To understand why Blenheim has faded from public awareness, one must first understand what makes it exceptional, and why brilliance and execution often resist the simplification demanded by collective memory. Blenheim's perfection is not flashy, it is methodological. Marlborough did not rely on single-handed heroics or dramatic last-minute charges that make for cinematic storytelling. The triumph was in preparation, deception, timing, and coordination. Historians marvel at how Marlborough manipulated terrain, anticipated enemy decisions, orchestrated complex maneuvers across marshes and rivers, and integrated artillery, infantry, and cavalry into a seamless, synchronized strike. Each component of the battle served a purpose. Every decision, from the initial feints to the secret march of 250 miles, was deliberate. The result was a victory that was efficient, decisive, and strategically transformative. Yet, for the general public, history often remembers drama over discipline, spectacle over strategy. Waterloo is iconic because of the narrative clarity, Napoleon's hubris, the heroic defense by Wellington, the climactic cavalry charges at the end of a long campaign. Trafalgar endures because Nelson's death atop the HMS Victory provides a tangible, almost mythic focal point. Agincourt resonates for the same reason. A small English force bows against odds, triumphing in a single, dramatic episode. Blenheim, by contrast, is a tapestry of strategy and coordination, not a single moment of cinematic heroism. Its perfection lies in execution over spectacle, a nuance often lost in popular retellings of history. Another factor in Blenheim's obscurity is geography and cultural memory. The battle took place in Bavaria, far from the British Isles and from the French centers of power. While its consequences were felt across Europe, the battlefield itself became a distant, almost abstract concept in British and French collective memory. Unlike Waterloo, where the battlefield is located near major population centers and is celebrated with monuments, Blenheim exists largely in historical texts, maps, and scholarly works. Even the Duke of Marlborough's Blenheim Palace, built to commemorate the victory, is more often recognized as architectural grandeur than as a marker of a pivotal military campaign. The political landscape of Europe also contributed to its fading. The War of the Spanish Succession, of which Blenheim was a part, spanned multiple theaters, hundreds of engagements, and years of conflict. While Blenheim was decisive, it was one battle among many in a complex and protracted war. Over time, narratives simplified history to focus on single leaders or climactic confrontations. The cumulative genius of Marlborough's campaign, its planning, deception, and execution, was absorbed into broader accounts of European power struggles rather than celebrated as a standalone spectacle. Yet historians continue to study Blenheim not for its fame, but for its lessons. The battle is often cited as a quintessential example of operational brilliance in early modern warfare. Marlborough's ability to anticipate enemy decisions, manipulate perceptions, and synchronize complex maneuvers across a wide battlefield remains a benchmark for military education. He demonstrated that war is not merely the collision of armies, but a contest of minds as much as of muscle. The integration of psychological insight, terrain, logistics, and timing exemplifies why some scholars describe Blenheim as the most perfect battle ever fought. The meticulous orchestration of the battlefield is especially striking. Marlborough anticipated the overconfidence of Marshal Tallard and exploited it ruthlessly. French units, certain in the security of their positions, were drawn into traps, overextended, and eventually forced to surrender. The timing of cavalry charges, the placement of artillery, and the coordination of infantry assaults were executed with near-flawless precision. Every variable, terrain, weather, troop fatigue, morale, enemy assumptions, was accounted for. This level of operational mastery is rarely seen in history and provides a core of Blenheim's enduring fascination among scholars. One cannot overstate the psychological brilliance involved. Marlborough's deception began long before the first cannon fired. His march of 250 miles across Europe, conducted with secrecy and misdirection, sowed confusion among both allies and enemies. By manipulating expectations, Marlborough controlled the battlefield mentally before doing so physically. Tallard's decisions, made in confidence, were rendered ineffective by the clever exploitation of perception and timing. This dimension of warfare, the battle in the minds of commanders and soldiers, is one of the reasons Blenheim is studied not only as a historical event but as a case study in leadership, strategy, and human behavior under extreme conditions. Additionally, the scale and coordination of the operation contributed to its perfection. Marlborough's army, numbering 40,000, moved and fought as a single organism. Infantry, cavalry, and artillery were integrated to maximize efficiency. Units move in precise synchrony. Reinforcements were committed at calculated intervals, and logistical considerations were meticulously managed. The result was a decisive victory that minimized unnecessary casualties while neutralizing a formidable enemy. In short, the battle demonstrates the power of preparation, discipline, and foresight over brute force alone. The paradox of Blenheim is that its very perfection may have contributed to its obscurity. Because the victory was achieved with such precision and intelligence, it lacked the chaos, drama, and spectacle that capture popular imagination. Unlike battles defined by sudden heroics, desperate last stands, or dramatic reversals, Blenheim unfolded largely according to plan, with each element performing as intended. Its brilliance is subtle, requiring careful study to appreciate fully, a quality that makes it ideal for historians but less resonant in public storytelling. Yet, despite this relative obscurity in popular memory, the legacy of Blenheim is undeniable. It altered the course of the War of the Spanish Succession, shifted the balance of power in Europe, and solidified Britain's emerging status as a continental power. It demonstrated the effectiveness of integrated coalition warfare, the importance of deception and intelligence, and the value of psychological insight in military operations. These lessons reverberate in military academies to this day, serving as a template for understanding operational brilliance in both historical and modern contexts. Furthermore, Blenheim's story is a reminder of the human dimension of warfare. Soldiers endured grueling marches, harsh terrain, and intense combat, yet performed with discipline and courage. Commanders had to think strategically while managing fear, fatigue, and uncertainty among troops. Leadership, trust, and morale were as critical to the outcome as muskets and cannons. Marlborough's genius lay not only in tactical brilliance, but in the ability to inspire, coordinate, and maintain cohesion under extreme pressure, a combination that few commanders have mastered. Finally, the battle invites reflection on how we remember history. The things we celebrate often depend on narrative clarity, dramatic imagery, or symbolic resonance. Blenheim, with its subtle brilliance and meticulous execution, challenges these criteria. Its lessons are complex, its heroism collective rather than singular, and its drama intellectual rather than purely visual. Yet for those willing to look deeper, it is a story of audacity, genius, and the extraordinary capacity of human beings to shape the course of history through preparation, insight, and courage. To stand on the battlefield of Blenheim today, even centuries later, is to feel the echoes of that extraordinary day. The fog, the rolling fields, the river that once served as a strategic obstacle, these elements remind us that history is lived through decisions, risks, and human ingenuity. Marlborough's victory was not merely the result of chance or numbers. It was a culmination of vision, planning, and relentless execution. It is a testament to what is possible when intelligence, courage, and leadership converge in the crucible of conflict. In sum, Blenheim remained perfect because of its precision, audacity, and lasting impact. It has been forgotten by the general public, overshadowed by battles with more dramatic or easily narrativized moments. But among historians, strategists, and military scholars, it is revered as a pinnacle of operational mastery. It teaches us that sometimes the greatest victories are those won with subtle brilliance rather than spectacle, and that history often conceals as much as it reveals. Blenheim is a battle worth remembering, not only for what it achieved, but for the lessons it imparts about leadership, strategy, and the human capacity to triumph against seemingly insurmountable odds. And as we continue to explore this remarkable campaign, the story of Marlborough, his audacious march, and the perfectly executed assault on the French unfolds further, revealing layers of brilliance that even centuries later can inspire awe and admiration. By the time Marlborough's forces engaged the French at Blenheim, the battlefield was a carefully prepared stage, and every move was part of a larger, calculated plan. The Duke's understanding of tactics went beyond mere troop placement. It involved the integration of infantry, cavalry, and artillery into a fluid, dynamic system designed to exploit enemy weaknesses while minimizing his own losses. One of the most striking elements of the battle was the use of cavalry. Far from being a simple shock force, Marlborough deployed mounted troops with precision, timing their charges to coincide with artillery bombardments and infantry advances. Imagine the scene. Squadrons of horsemen, gleaming in the foggy morning light, surging forward at exactly the moment the French were distracted or overstretched. These charges weren't just about force. They were psychological weapons, breaking the morale of unit before the infantry even closed in. The cavalry acted as a hammer to the infantry's anvil, shattering cohesion in the French lines and creating openings that could be exploited immediately. Equally important was Marlborough's focus on flanking maneuvers. While the French were concentrated along the Nebel stream and confident in their fortifications, Marlborough sought to stretch their line and attack from unexpected directions. By threatening the flanks and rear of the French positions, he forced Tallard to react, often committing reserves too late or in the wrong place. This created a cascading effect. As one sector weakened, the stress propagated through the French formations, leading to confusion, miscommunication, and ultimately collapse. In essence, Marlborough turned positional advantage against the enemy, making their confidence in the defensive terrain a liability rather than a strength. The coordination between infantry and artillery was another hallmark of tactical brilliance. Marlborough positioned his guns to maximize coverage of key points while simultaneously masking the movement of advancing troops. Artillery fire softened enemy positions and disrupted formations, allowing infantry units to cross dangerous areas like the Martian Nebel stream with reduced risk. Each volley was timed, each battery placed with purpose, creating a rhythm of attack that the French could not counter effectively. The battlefield itself became an instrument of strategy, shaped and exploited by Marlborough's foresight. French disorganization compounded the effectiveness of these tactics. Tallard, overconfident in his defensive position, failed to adequately coordinate his units or anticipate the Allies' simultaneous multidirectional attacks. As Marlborough struck the flanks, French reserves were shifted to plug gaps, leaving other sectors vulnerable. Communication breakdowns occurred as orders failed to reach frontline units in time, leading to isolated pockets of troops unable to support one another. This lack of cohesion was disastrous. When one segment of the line collapsed, it triggered a chain reaction, magnifying the impact of Marlborough's carefully orchestrated strikes. The timing of these attacks was critical. Marlborough understood that synchronization was as important as strength. Cavalry charges, artillery barrages, and infantry advances were not random or reactive. They were executed in a deliberate sequence designed to maximize confusion and minimize enemy recovery. Every phase of the battle reinforced the next, creating a momentum that Talard could not counter. The Allies, moving as a single, cohesive organism, imposed their rhythm on the battlefield, dictating the pace and terms of engagement. Perhaps the most telling evidence of Marlborough's tactical genius is the surrender of 12,000 elite French soldiers without firing a shot. By the time these troops realized the full scope of the Allied maneuvers, their positions were untenable, escape routes blocked, and morale shattered. This mass capitulation, achieved without direct combat, underscores the psychological dimension of Marlborough's tactics. He did not merely defeat the French physically. He defeated their confidence, their command structure, and their ability to respond effectively. Blenheim, therefore, stands as a case study in integrated warfare. Marlborough's use of cavalry, his focus on flanking, his coordination of infantry and artillery, and his exploitation of enemy misjudgments all combined to create a battle that was both tactically and operationally perfect. It was a demonstration of how intelligence, timing, and leadership can multiply the effectiveness of even a numerically comparable force, turning perceived disadvantage into overwhelming advantage. In the end, the brilliance of Blenheim was not in individual heroics but in systemic execution. Every unit, every move, every decision was part of a larger plan, and the success of the battle depended on the seamless interaction of all these elements. Marlborough's ability to control the battlefield, anticipate the enemy, and exploit weaknesses is what elevates Blenheim from a mere victory to a masterpiece of military strategy. It is this combination of tactical precision and operational foresight that continues to inspire historians, military scholars, and strategists even centuries later. As the morning fog lifted over the Nebel stream, the Battle of Blenheim unfolded in full intensity, revealing the drama, chaos, and brilliance that made it one of the most remarkable military engagements in history. Every maneuver, charge, and volley was part of a larger tapestry of strategy, but certain moments would determine the fate of a day and the future of Europe. One of the earliest critical moments came with the French under Marshal Talard overcommitting to their defensive positions. Confident in the strength of the Nebel stream, fortified redoubts, and natural obstacles, Talard concentrated a large portion of his army along predictable lines. This concentration created vulnerabilities elsewhere. Marlborough, observing from a distance, had anticipated this very reaction. He deliberately drew French attention to certain sectors through feints and minor skirmishes, then struck where the enemy least expected. The first major clash occurred when Allied cavalry, timed with precision, surged across the marshy banks of the Nebel. The ground was treacherous, the waterlogged terrain threatening to bog down horses and men alike. Yet the Allied horsemen pressed forward, exploiting French hesitation. Imagine the scene, mud splashing beneath galloping hooves, cavalry sabers flashing, and the enemy caught between advancing infantry and relentless artillery fire. The psychological impact of these charges cannot be overstated. French units that had felt secure suddenly found their flanks exposed, and their lines collapsing under a coordinated onslaught. At the same time, Marlborough's artillery played a pivotal role. Positioned on higher ground, Allied guns unleashed a continuous barrage, targeting key fortifications and troop concentrations. Cannon fire shattered French defensive structures and disrupted their formations, allowing infantry to advance through otherwise deadly zones. Marlborough understood that artillery could shape the battlefield before soldiers even engaged in hand-to-hand combat. The combination of firepower, maneuver, and timing exemplified his mastery of integrated warfare. Errors by the French command compounded the Allies' advantage. Talard struggled to coordinate responses to multiple simultaneous threats. Orders were delayed, units were misallocated, and reserves failed to arrive at critical moments. French soldiers, previously confident in their positions, became isolated and vulnerable. This lack of cohesion turned the French army's numerical strength into a liability. Instead of supporting each other, units were overwhelmed in sequence, unable to reinforce or stabilize their lines effectively. The mid-morning phase of the battle saw desperate French cavalry charges aimed at regaining control of exposed flanks. These maneuvers, bold but poorly timed, collided with well-prepared Allied infantry and artillery. The assaults were repelled with devastating losses, further eroding morale. The combination of misjudgment and Allied discipline transformed the French's confidence into chaos. Marlborough had not just anticipated these attacks. He had created conditions where any counteroffensive would fail, maximizing the psychological and tactical impact. Perhaps the most dramatic episode came on the French right flank. Marlborough had identified weaknesses in the alignment and the overextension of forces. Coordinated infantry advances, supported by concentrated artillery, began to penetrate French defenses. Cavalry units simultaneously threatened the rear, cutting off retreat paths. The effect was catastrophic. Soldiers found themselves trapped between multiple threats, unable to coordinate, and facing annihilation. Panic spread, and the once formidable French line began to unravel. Throughout these crucial hours, Marlborough maintained control over the battlefield with remarkable composure. Orders were relayed efficiently, units reinforced strategically, and momentum was preserved. His ability to integrate multiple dimensions, infantry, cavalry, artillery, terrain, and timing, into a coherent, adaptable plan illustrates why historians describe Blenheim as perfect. Every element was synchronized to exploit enemy mistakes, yet Marlborough remained flexible, ready to adjust as circumstances evolved. By midday, the cumulative effect of strategic pressure, coordinated attacks, and French misjudgments became undeniable. Large portions of Tallard's army were disorganized, retreating in confusion, or forced into untenable positions. It was at this point that one of the most remarkable outcomes of the battle occurred, the surrender of approximately 12,000 elite French troops without firing a shot. These were seasoned soldiers, trained to fight, yet the precision and overwhelming coordination of the Allied attack made resistance futile. The surrender was a testament not only to Marlborough's strategy, but also to the psychological impact of disciplined execution and tactical superiority. Meanwhile, other sectors of the battlefield saw repeated assaults and counter-assaults. French infantry attempted to hold key positions along the Nebel, but sustained artillery bombardments and flanking maneuvers steadily eroded their cohesion. Allied cavalry, exploiting openings, cut through weakened lines, creating pockets of isolation and surrender. The battle evolved into a sequence of controlled pressures, each exploiting vulnerabilities revealed by the previous engagement. Marlborough's foresight ensured that these successive phases amplified the overall effect, rather than dissipating energy in disorganized skirmishes. The chaos was not confined to one side. Allied troops, too, faced a fog, marshy terrain, and fatigue from months of secretive marches. Yet their discipline, instilled by months of training and inspired by Marlborough's leadership, allowed them to maintain cohesion under extreme stress. This human element, morale, trust, and endurance, proved as decisive as artillery or cavalry maneuvers. Soldiers who might have faltered in lesser hands remained committed, following the plan with remarkable precision. As afternoon approached, the final collapse of French resistance became evident. Units that had initially been strong now fragmented, isolated pockets surrendered, and coordinated defense became impossible. The cumulative effect of earlier tactical brilliance, the psychological pressure from constant threat, and the inability of French commanders to adapt ensured a decisive outcome. By the day's end, Blenheim was won, a victory that was not just tactical, but operational and psychological, reshaping the balance of power in Europe. In the aftermath, the battlefield bore witness to both the brilliance and the brutality of 18th century warfare. Thousands of French soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured. Allied troops, though victorious, were exhausted, having executed a complex and demanding plan under extreme conditions. The scale of coordination, the timing of every movement, and the exploitation of enemy weaknesses revealed a level of strategic mastery rarely seen in European warfare. Blenheim's key moments, the cavalry charges, artillery barrages, flanking attacks, and mass surrender, illustrate why the battle is still studied centuries later. It was a combination of tactical audacity, precise execution, and psychological insight that produced a result both decisive and transformative. The errors of the French, while significant, were magnified by Marlborough's anticipation and preparation, highlighting how leadership and planning can convert potential obstacles into opportunities. Ultimately, the Battle of Blenheim was a demonstration of how warfare can be orchestrated with precision, intelligence, and audacity. It was not merely a clash of armies, but a carefully choreographed sequence of actions designed to maximize advantage and exploit enemy weaknesses. The surrender of elite French troops, the collapse of fortified positions, and the decisive flanking maneuvers all underscore why Blenheim is remembered by historians as a masterclass in military strategy, even if its story has faded from popular memory. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the Battle of Blenheim reached its dramatic conclusion. Marlborough's plan, executed with near-flawless precision, had brought the French army to the brink of collapse. Entire formations were shattered, command lines were broken, and panic spread among Tallard's forces. The battlefield, once foggy and chaotic, now bore the unmistakable signs of total Allied dominance. Marshal Tallard, overwhelmed by the coordinated assaults and flanking maneuvers, had no choice but to surrender. Captured along with thousands of his men, he would spend years in captivity, a symbol of French miscalculation and Marlborough's genius. The surrender of elite troops without resistance highlighted the psychological mastery Marlborough had exerted. The French were defeated not only physically but mentally, their confidence eroded before the full force of battle could break them. The remaining French forces attempted to retreat, but Allied cavalry and infantry maintained pressure, cutting off escape routes and forcing a disorganized withdrawal. What had begun as a seemingly impregnable position along the Nebel stream ended in chaos, with French units scattering and regrouping wherever they could. Marlborough, always conscious of the strategic picture, ensured that his victory was decisive rather than Pyrrhic, preserving the cohesion of his army and maximizing the long-term impact of the engagement. For the Allied soldiers, exhaustion mixed with exhilaration. Months of grueling marches, secret maneuvers, and tactical precision culminated in a triumph that few could have imagined. They had faced one of Europe's largest armies in a fortified position and emerged victorious. The battlefield itself, littered with casualties and the detritus of combat, stood as a testament to their discipline, courage, and resilience. Blind conclusion did more than end a battle. It shifted the balance of power in Europe. Vienna was saved, the French advance halted, and Britain's status as a continental power solidified. Marlborough had achieved a victory that combined operational brilliance with strategic foresight, setting a precedent for coalition warfare and the importance of leadership, timing, and psychological insight in shaping the outcome of battles. The echoes of Blenheim would resonate across Europe for decades. Marlborough's audacious strategy and flawless execution had not only defeated France but reshaped the political and military landscape. The capture of Tallard symbolized the vulnerability of even the mightiest commanders, while the surrender of elite troops without a fight underscored the power of psychological mastery. Allied leaders celebrated, understanding the significance of what had been achieved. Vienna remained secure, alliances were strengthened, and Britain's reputation on the continent soared. Blenheim demonstrated that victory is not merely a matter of numbers or fortifications. It is a result of planning, timing, coordination, and insight. Marlborough's genius lay in combining these elements seamlessly, transforming a seemingly impossible challenge into a decisive triumph. Yet, despite its monumental impact, Blenheim is often overshadowed in popular memory by battles with more dramatic narratives. Its brilliance lies in precision rather than spectacle, in systemic mastery rather than individual heroics. For historians and military scholars, however, it remains a benchmark of tactical and operational excellence. The Battle of Blenheim stands as a timeless lesson in strategy, leadership, and the human capacity to achieve the extraordinary. It reminds us that audacity, preparation, and disciplined execution can alter the course of nations, and that sometimes the most perfect victories are those won with intelligence, foresight, and unwavering resolve. Marlborough's triumph at Blenheim was not just a battle. It was a moment Britain stepped onto the European stage as a superpower, forever changing the destiny of the continent.